Welcome back to The Explainer, everyone. Today, we're diving into something absolutely fascinating. And let's be honest, kind of intimidating. The Cardiovascular Surgical Coding Guidelines. It is a highly dense world of numbers and rules, and yeah, one wrong move can literally trigger a massive audit. But don't worry, I am beyond thrilled to guide you through it. We're going to break down these complex rules so you can master them completely and confidently apply them to your next, let's call it, messy operative note.
Now, I want you to just think about this for a second. How exactly do you translate a beating heart into the language of healthcare? Medical coding, it's really not just data entry or pushing administrative paperwork. It's a critical translation of life-saving, cutting-edge surgical innovation into a universally understood, highly structured system. Basically, every single code tells the story of a specific procedure, a specific technology, and ultimately, a specific patient outcome.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First up, pacemakers and defibrillators. Then, phrenic nerves and arrhythmias. Third, transcatheter valve procedures. And finally, we'll wrap up with coronary artery bypass grafting. All right, moving right into Section 1, pacemakers and defibrillators, or what we'll call the baseline. Understanding the actual physical hardware here is the absolute key to choosing your right code. And this brilliantly illustrates why that physical footprint matters so much. There's a core difference here that completely dictates the code set you choose. A traditional pacemaker system, well, that involves a pulse generator, one or more leads, and a subcutaneous pocket, usually right there in the subclavicular site. But a leadless pacemaker is an absolute modern marvel. It's an all-in-one pulse generator with a built-in battery and electrode, and it's implanted directly into a cardiac chamber via a transvenous catheter. Because that physical footprint is totally different, the coding pathways are entirely distinct. Which actually brings us to our very first coder trap. You've got to watch out for this one. If your surgeon inserts a permanent, leadless, right ventricular pacemaker that's code 33274, you absolutely cannot report right heart catheterization codes 93451 through 93461. Why? Well, because the CPT guidelines consider the catheter insertion into the right ventricle, the imaging guidance, and the device evaluation to be totally baked into that insertion code already. The only exception here, if a complete right heart cath is performed for a totally distinct clinical reason, completely separate from the leadless pacemaker procedure. Now, before we move on from rhythm devices, I really want to highlight code 33214. This is what's known as the upgrade rule. So what happens when a patient's condition requires upgrading from a single-chamber system up to a dual-chamber system? You don't bill this massive list of individual codes. Actually, code 33214 is a beautiful, all-encompassing code. It bundles the removal of the old pulse generator, the testing of the existing lead, the insertion of the new lead, and the insertion of the new pulse generator all into one single event. Pretty neat, right? Moving right along to Section 2, phrenic nerves and arrhythmias, or as I like to think of it, the electrical grid. To code this accurately, we really need to ground the guidelines in the physical reality of the surgical procedures themselves. A true cornerstone of this section is the maze procedure. The source material crisply defines this as operative tissue ablation, disruption, and reconstruction, specifically designed to isolate the triggers of supraventricular dysrhythmias. But here is the crucial detail for us in coding. If the surgeon also excludes the left atrial appendage, whether they're stapling, oversewing, ligating, or placating it, during this maze procedure, it's inherently included, meaning you cannot report it as a separate service. And guess what? We have another coder trap for the electrical grid. When it comes to operative tissue ablation codes 33254 through 33256, the guidelines lay down a very strict restriction. You must not report these specific codes if there is a concurrently performed procedure that requires a median sternotomy or cardiopulmonary bypass. Basically, if the chest is already open for another major cardiac procedure, a completely different set of add-on codes has to be used to capture that ablation. Let's move to and see how this builds a perfectly logical framework for billing left atrial appendage exclusion. It's really just a simple if this, then that flow. Step 1. Identify your surgeon's approach. Is it open or thoracoscopic? Step 2. Check the operative note for concurrent maze or mitral valve procedures, because as we just learned, LA exclusion is inherent to those and not separately billable. And finally, Step 3. You only use code 33267 for LA exclusion if it's a standalone open procedure without another concurrent sternotomy. Make sense? All right, on to Section 3, transcatheter valve procedures, aka the valve revolution. Translating these minimally invasive cutting-edge procedures requires meticulous attention to the bundling rules. First, I want to spotlight code 33361. This is the foundational code for TAVR. That's transcatheter aortic valve replacement when performed via a percutaneous femoral artery approach. This code represents a massive technological leap in cardiac care, and because of that, the guidelines surrounding it are incredibly robust. Now, what's really interesting about this breakdown is just how incredibly strict the CPT guidelines are about what's bundled versus what you can actually bill separately for these transcatheter replacements. Notice the included services here: the percutaneous access, deploying the valve, the procedural guidance, the local angiography, and even closing the arteriotomy. It's all one neat package. So what is separately reportable? Well, a same-day diagnostic coronary angiography, but only if it's performed to evaluate a completely new clinical issue, like, say, a sudden clinical change during the procedure itself. Also, pay close attention to this explicit instruction straight from the source material regarding TAVR procedures. It plainly states that TAVR requires 2 physician operators, and all components of the procedure must be reported using modifier 62 for co-surgery. Listen, it's not a suggestion. It is a strict coding requirement that directly reflects the immense complexity of the intervention. Okay, it is time for one more major coder trap, and honestly, this one is a classic billing pitfall. Codes 33310 through 33315 represent cardiotomy for thrombus removal. The golden rule here: do not report these in conjunction with other cardiac procedures, unless a completely separate incision in the heart is required to remove that clot. So, if the surgeon simply scoops out a thrombus through the same incision they already made for another repair, it is bundled, don't bill it.
Finally, Section 4, coronary artery bypass grafting. We'll call this one the plumbing. The rules here are incredibly dense, for sure, but they are highly systematic.
The absolute most important thing to grasp with CABG is the rigid separation of venous versus arterial grafts. Here's the sequential logic you're going to need. Step 1. Identify if the bypass grafts used are venous only. Step 2. If they are venous only, you simply use the base codes 33510 through 33516, just depending on the number of grafts. But Step 3. If an arterial graft is mixed with those venous grafts, you absolutely cannot use those base codes alone. You must report 2 codes, the combined arterial venous graft code plus the specific arterial graft code. So, the crucial point here is knowing exactly which vessel harvests are bundled and which ones earn distinct reporting. Procurement of the saphenous vein, that is entirely included in the base bypass codes. You do not report it separately. However, if the surgeon has to harvest an upper extremity artery or vein, that extra surgical work is distinctly recognized and you can report it separately, using codes like 35500 for a vein or 33509 and 35600 for an artery. And to capture exactly how technology is changing these plumbing procedures, we have add-on code 33508. You use this code specifically when the surgeon performs a surgical endoscopy with video-assisted harvest of a vein for the bypass. It just seamlessly translates that new technological addition right into your code sequence. Bringing it all home to the critical translation, translating innovation to healthcare. We've journeyed through rhythm devices, the electrical grid, transcatheter valve revolutions, and bypass plumbing. By categorizing all these super dense rules into logical buckets, we essentially transform raw, complex surgical data into clear, compliant, and highly accurate healthcare narratives. So, I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to ponder. As surgical innovation continues to rapidly evolve from traditional open-heart procedures all the way to these incredible transcatheter marvels, how will your understanding of these guidelines ensure you perfectly translate the future of medicine? Your role is absolutely vital. Take this logical framework, apply it to your very next chart, and keep learning. Thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer.